blah reasons. But if you're interested in mushroom cultivation, let me know. My name's Ryath, and we're looking to get members, and then the members of the committee will decide what we want to do with the committee. But yeah, that's all. And like what we want to do for events or workshops or skills or what's that? Yeah, cultivating mushrooms. Yeah, mushroom cultivation committee for the full name, or fungal cultivation committee, we should say. I think. Were there other questions now, or no? Just come find me later, and we'll talk about it.
What are some exciting ideas that you have for the
No, it's to be decided by the membership. I think there's a whole lot we could do. It's a discussion to be had. Yes.
What have current members decided?
What's that?
What have
Okay, that's enough of that. Anyway, Gordon, thank you in advance for the presentation, and take it away.
Okay.
There you go.
Hi guys. My name's Gordon. I like mushrooms, and I like them so much I wrote a whole book about them. Who here has heard of Fascinated by Fungi? Okay, cool. That's a lot better than most rooms. I suppose this is sort of a selected audience. It's crazy to me that I have become, not an understatement to say, like the biggest mushroom account online. And that's like aggregate of across a bunch of different things, but like I have more followers than Paul Stamets does. And yet, if you say my name to most people who are into mushrooms, no one has any idea who I am, but of course everyone knows Stamets. So part of the idea of me trying to take what I have done online and legitimize that in the world so people might actually know who I am was to write a book. And I'm going to give you guys kind of an overview of that book. Some of you guys have it yourself, and I will happily sign it if anyone wants me to. But I've been trying to make sense of so many different things, because fungi is this just like incredibly broad, like intractable topic. And I think it's really intimidating for a lot of people who want to get into mushrooms, and particularly like fungi as a whole, because where do you start and how do you make sense of like all of the different aspects? And so as much as possible, that's what I kind of grappled with and tried to make sense of in the book. What I do online is pretty different, because a lot of what I do online is really just aimed at trying to catch people's attention, because social media is very much about the economy of attention. You have to have someone look at your post for more than 3 seconds for it to like count with the algorithm and to have people like want to engage with your content. So originally I started out by just posting Instagram photos basically, and then that kind of spiraled as I like started doing short form video content on TikTok, and then it's become this whole like ecosystem of content and other stuff. If you guys haven't seen my videos, ooh, sounds like most of you have. It's a little bit louder than I want to. So that's slime mold, that's Hecki, chanterelles, slime mold, jelly fungi, besides the cups, lichen, slime mold, slug, and that's kind of wax cap, another head Chlorosiboria, microheterotroph, droplets, E-cap, and puffball. So that one clip has been viewed like 40 million times alone on Facebook. And I have sort of endless number of videos that have all accumulated like 20 million views, 40 million views, which is like an insane amount of views. And like the view time on some of my things is literally like 20, 30, 40 years of real time, which is an absolutely insane thing to think that people have in the world spent like hours upon hours of their lives like staring at my videos, a lot of which are me just like whacking mushrooms and jiggling things. And it's like kind of hilarious to me, especially because a lot of those people are non-native English speakers. And that's one of the really interesting things to me, is that so much of my viewership comes from English countries. There's plenty of Commonwealth stuff. It's about 50-50, but there's a huge number of people from Southeast Asia, South America, Eastern Europe who engage with my content, and I have no idea what they're saying in the comments. But when I go ahead and like use some sort of translate function to see what their comments are, it's the same stupid shit that everyone else is saying. Which in some ways tells me that the misconceptions about mushrooms are sort of worldwide. And a lot of different countries and people have different attitudes towards them. America is much more mycophobic, scared of mushrooms, and sort of hateful and fearful and pushing away. then certainly Asia loves mushrooms and they're embraced, and they're kids' toys, and we're coming around to that. But a lot of this there was this building momentum and wave I was watching in the world, and I got to sort of lucky enough to be part of said wave as we're watching mushrooms and fungi become much more accepted and even loved and seen as like friends and allies instead of just as enemies. But there's still so much kind of misinformation out there that I felt like I wanted to try to put something into the world that would help people learn. And that was the idea behind writing this book, which was to make a really accessible thing, because the first thing for me, I had a lot of people ask, well, who's your audience? And that's the first thing you're supposed to do when you write a book, is like, tell who you're gonna sell the book to. And I said, well, everybody. And they're like, that's not good, Gordon, that's not smart. You need to sell it to a particular demographic. And I was like, yeah, but everyone loves mushrooms. Doesn't everyone want to buy a book about mushrooms and fungi? And the answer was, well, no, not if you're a nerdy PhD and you make people like read too much and it's too intractable. And I was like, all right, well, I'm gonna do my best to make this as accessible as possible. My background was doing PhD research on wine yeast, and I was working on like a really inane, special sort of physiological condition that wine yeast undergo in this epigenetic thing. I don't need to explain to you guys because it is intractable and it's silly. But I spent 7 years trying to explain my science to winemakers and then my winemaking to scientists. And so I got a lot of practice with trying to help people do this kind of cross-disciplinary science assessment. And that's kind of what I felt like I brought to the mushroom space, because most of the mushroom education that's out there is very much based in, well, some guy wrote in a book like 40 years ago and now we all take it as dogma kind of thing. So I was like, cool, I'm gonna like reassess things and try to do research and, do the work to make sure it's legitimate, but make it as accessible as possible. And to that point, I hope that no one reads the book cover to cover, but I hope that people constantly pick it up and flip through it. Because I don't think I wanted to write a book that would sit on a shelf when you were done with it. I want you to constantly pick it up and keep using it, because there's so much information in there. Even probably to a fault, there's about 2 pages that aren't fully filled with stuff, and even then I was like, hey publisher, can I put some photos here? Can I put some illustrations? They were like, no, Gordon, you were cut off. As much as possible, know that I wanted absolutely no blank space in the book, but I was forced to have 2 pages with blank space. But the idea was to write a book that was covering not just mushrooms, but like all kinds of fungi. And I hope that I did that. And there's a lot of holes there, but there's a lot more than most other books. And I dive into the biology, the ecology, biochemistry, so all of these interactions. I talk about edibility, I talk about foraging, everything you could really want from a mushroom book is there. There's not as much depth on a lot of things as I wish I could put in there, but I was limited by space and we had to get it done. So it's the best I could do in the time that I had. And another big part for me was making sure that other people's voices and perspectives were represented, because there is a little bit of a tendency in mycology to have people sort of hero worship one person over the work they've done, and those people deserve all the accolades they get. But I'd love to see those people help buoy up other people and sort of say, hey, look, it's not just me in this space. There's so many other incredible people doing work here. Why don't we pay attention to them? Especially like as a white guy, I need to make sure that other people notice people who are not white men, and like make sure that they are given a platform, make sure that they have a place and a voice in this community. And so I tried to do that as well with some of the people that I had like in the book and getting their perspectives. And was really trying to draw from a lot of different backgrounds and experiences to like, bring that through. So the format of the book is, the first half is sort of question answer, second half is like mushroom profiles, everything has a little QR code, so it's also integrated with technology and iNaturalist, and I hope that you guys enjoy reading it. So I'm gonna give you just kind of an overview of the book, and then we'll finish off with some info on morels if anyone wants to hear it. So, what's up, Brad?
Can we take just a step right, your left shoulder keep
Oh,
just a
sure.
Yeah, there you go.
Yeah. But you
Yeah, there you
you got the real thing. What do you need this picture of me?
go. Yeah, for the rest.
Okay, so what are fungi? Up until about 1970s, they were still considered plants, and that's like a big misconception that a lot of people have. So fungi are not plants. They are sort of an in-between with animals and plants. I'll talk a little bit more about the evolution in a second, but the big thing is plants are autotrophic, so they make their own food with the energy of the sun, photosynthesis, and they have sort of relatively like large square or like various geometric cells. fungi and animals are heterotrophic, so they have to consume food, they have to eat it, digest it. And the big difference there between sort of on a fundamental level of an animal versus a fungi is that fungi are digesting their food externally, whereas animals have to eat food, which is called phagocytosis, and like digesting it internally. And because of that, fungi are changing the environments they're in because they're excreting a lot of their digestive juices on the outside, and they're sort of fundamentally altering like the community structure of where they are. And that's like a broad property of fungi everywhere on the planet. And everywhere on the planet has fungi. So if you guys have ever heard the phrase like mushrooms will save the world, I hate that, I reject it. We live in a fungal world already. This is their world. They are the glue that holds this world together because they have fundamentally altered and created the community structure everywhere on Earth, allowing life to happen. And so in many ways, to me, fungi are sort of the keystone of what we view as life, right? The ability of plants to exist on land is mostly because of fungi. A lot of the animals and interactions that happen in the world are sort of like silently puppeted by fungi. And this is a thing that I kind of realized the more and more I dove into this and the more I learned, and I'm hoping to convey some of that to you guys. So fungi have a lot of different forms. I'll talk about more of them on the next slide, but fundamentally, sort of filamentous mycelium is usually what we think of as like the body of fungi. Mushrooms tend to be sort of discrete, temporary fruiting structures, literally like a fruit or a flower. And then there's things like lichens, which are sort of this like hybrid of fungi providing structure and then like an algae or a cyanobacteria doing some photosynthesis. So that has something in common with a plant, but it is distinctly not a plant. And then there's, plants are partnered with fungi in a lot of different ways. There's mycorrhizae, as endophytes. Many of those things can also be parasitic, and I'll talk about that. And animals have partnered with fungi in all sorts of ways. There's leafcutter ants that have this incredibly productive partnership with fungi, and it's one of the most productive partnerships on the entire planet because they have just an insane amount of biomass and can strip like entire forests and go feed all that plant matter to the fungi that lives in their nests. And then, I don't know, there's termites, there's all sorts of animals that have sort of like partnered with fungi and this like farming them essentially. There's humans who like fungi, and there's me being very excited about Amanita muscaria. And there's an orca because they hate billionaires just like I do. Okay, forms of fungi. So this is not perfect, but this was sort of like the most brute force forms of fungi that I could stuff everything into, and there's a few things that really don't fit in this scheme, but this was my sort of brute force attempt to like make sense of all the different forms that fungi take. So we have molds, which are filamentous but do not form mushrooms. We have yeasts, which are single-celled fungi but do not form filaments. We have lichens, which are filamentous but are really sort of a combination of like the algae and the fungal partner. And usually lichens also include some other types of fungi in there, like yeasts are inside of lichens, so that's kind of complicated. And there are mushrooms, which are the sort of charismatic macrofungi that we all relate to and we like because we can hunt and we can eat them, and they're really neat looking. And then there's aquatic parasitoids, which are things that are kind of a stretch to imagine as fungi because they like live in water and they can swim around, and they don't really meet our definition of what we think of fungi as, but they are the ancestral lineage of fungi, and they grow sort of little, what are called rhizoids, but sort of, filamentous like structures, and a lot of them are like parasitic on algae and small mammals and stuff like that. And there's an aquatic fungi, or a chytrid is the sort of the category that those things fall into, and there's a chytrid that has like killed like half of the salamanders on Earth, and it's a really horrible disease. And so there's a tendency people like always view fungi as sometimes very positive, but also sometimes very negative, and that is the duality that they represent, is that there's a lot of good and bad that can come out of them. But these sort of basic forms are the things that I ascribe, like most things in the book, I try to like smash them into these categories. There's stuff like rusts and smuts, which don't super fit into these categories, and I think I classify them technically as molds, but they're sort of in between a mushroom and a mold, but we don't need to talk about it. Anyhow, we've only, in theory, discovered about 5 to 10% of the fungal species in the world, according to estimates. And that is true, but I think a lot of that black matter we don't know about is going to be like really microscopic things that aren't super exciting. We know most of the big charismatic macrofungi, and these 5 basic forms really underlie like a tremendous amount of complexity with all of the like insanity of different forms that fungi have taken in our world, especially in kingdom Dicaria, which is what's represented here. I use this is a thing from Laszlo Nagy's lab, and I wanted to make a poster sort of like this for my book, and at some point I was like, why reinvent the wheel? Let's just use this. And in the book, the labels are entirely too small for you to read them, but that's okay, because there's a QR code to the full resolution thing. You can go online and read it. So where are fungi and what do they do? I had an illustrator, Ben Gibson, do all my illustrations, and he was sort of, for me, like the perfect guy, because he was like right in between what a textbook and an infographic looks like, and so I'm like really happy with the way that things look. And he did a phenomenal job like sticking in all of the tiny little bits of information that I wanted to include. So fungi are everywhere, and that was, we think about them being inside of plants, associated with the roots as mycorrhizae. We think of them decaying organic material. Those are the kind of places we think about them being. But it turns out they're inside of plants as endophytes, they're on the leaves as epiphytes, they are in the guts of animals. We have important fungi that are inside of our guts. We have fungi that are all over our skin. There's fungi in the deep ocean. There's fungi, spores in the stratosphere. They turns out to be present in like a lot of extreme environments. We never would have thought fungi were there, but we just weren't using the right tools to look for them. So it turns out that they're everywhere, and they're just as common as pretty much every other form of life, if not more common. And like I talked about, they have a tendency to kind of transform the area around them because they're digesting stuff externally. And so in the carbon and nitrogen cycle, they play a really important role in helping to break down complex carbohydrates. And there's sort of a division of labor there between bacteria and fungi, and the bacteria tend to focus on like nitrogen-rich things, whereas fungi tend to focus on like carbon-rich things. And so, there is a tendency to associate fungi with like death and decay, but it's really more of a plant thing than like an animal thing. That being said, there are certain types of fungi that can digest keratin, because most fungi can't really get traction on our bodies. There's not a lot for them to eat because we're not full of plant sugars. But there are, the Onigales is an order of fungi that can digest keratin. And so those are a lot of things that actually cause like fungal disease. I wrote about Coccicoides, the desert fever, whatever. There's fungi that can like cause horrible disease for us. Because there are certain things that can digest us. So it's one thing to be aware of. But the important part of this is that fungi are there helping to recycle nutrients, and so they're sort of like setting the table for everyone else to eat. And that's, I think, another really fundamental thing to sort of understand is having fungi present sets up a whole like ecological succession of then who else gets to like play at the party, and by having them there, they're a little bit like a, what's called an environmental engineer. If you guys have heard of the concept of like elephants in the savannah, having them there, they're eating so much plant matter and changing things that they fundamentally alter the structure of like the savannah around them. And fungi are like that in this like microbial sense, and that just them being there, putting out these enzymes and affecting the world around them means that everything else down the road changes. And usually for the better, because again, they are sort of the keystone of what makes life possible. There's been a lot of thoughts that maybe fungi came from another planet. They seem so wild and sort of intractable and hard to understand that maybe they're just aliens. And even my first experience with mushrooms that I remember was finding a parrot mushroom, little green slimy mushroom. I was dead convinced it was an alien. It's not, but I was like, it's green and it's slimy. It must be an alien. And there's been certain people who have a tendency to sort of like state this as if it were like fact or truth. Unfortunately, there's nothing to support that. It's a great idea, and we have some evidence that shows that like lichens can survive the vacuum of space, but when we look at like the evolution of fungi, it tracks with everything else here on land. So on sort of a time scale, plants and animals and fungi split off around like 1.7, so billion years ago, so plants kind of became their own thing. And then animals and fungi kind of co-evolved for a while, and then about 1 billion years ago, they split too. So although fungi and animals are more similar to each other than they are to plants, there's still 1 billion years worth of evolution between them. And the evolution of fungi is hard to track because they didn't leave a lot of fossils in the way that like animals and plants did. Mycelium is not going to fossilize quite as easily. But we do have some good kind of what's called molecular clock data, where we've looked at like big gene sets and compared them over things, and these big, genetic comparison kind of things. And that's given us some good timelines and ideas of like when some stuff emerged. So sort of we saw that the emergence of like mycorrhizal-like relationships coming out like 400 million years ago. That's around the time that lichens first arose. It's really hard to say like when mushrooms first came up, but sort of there's a guess that maybe about 300 million years ago, some proto-mushrooms like a jelly fungi might have emerged. But a lot of the mushrooms we recognize as mushrooms probably didn't start showing up until about 100 million years ago. And then a lot of the stuff that we've seen now, the current diversity is more probably like 50, 60 million years ago. And a lot of those jumps in fungal diversity came from periods of time where there was a big die-off. So if you have a lot of dead plant material, you have a lot of like open food, and that's a great time for fungi to diversify and like try new strategies and see what they're gonna eat. So in general, the evolution of fungi is in parallel with everything else on this planet, and that's part of why they're so important, because they interact with everything, and they've been like manipulating things and pushing things, good or bad, the entire time that life has been happening. And it's cool to think they're from outer space, but we don't have any evidence for that. So. Okay, so this is a very simplified version of fungal taxonomy, but this was kind of like the classic one, and I'm coming back to it as what I call the ABCZ scheme. So there's chytrid mycota, which is the sort of aquatic parasitoids. There's the zygomycetes fungi, which is basically filamentous molds. Neither one of those produce mushrooms, but ascomycota and basidiomycota in kingdom Dicaria do produce mushrooms. So those are the ones that we tend to care the most about. That's also where most of the fungal diversity is in kingdom Dicaria, at least that we know of so far. There's also these sort of epistonauts. These are things that don't necessarily contain chitin, and so they're not considered like true fungi, and they're also like, they swim around, sometimes they eat stuff. So there's this huge spectrum of things that could be sort of like kind of considered fungi, but aren't quite. And with this book, I try to stick to just these things that are like osmotrophic as my definition of what a true fungi is it's digesting externally as opposed to like eating food. Again, when you get into the weeds with this kind of stuff, there's like 20 plus phyla, and it's changing all the time, and people are arguing back and forth about what it is. I wanted to give some like really definitive numbers, and then I got so into the weeds with this, and it's like, I'm out of my depth. So I'm gonna fall back on the simple scheme because it's really good and descriptive. And you can continue to like check the updates in the literature to see like how many new phyla people are arguing there are. Fungi reproduce in a very simple way, right? They make spores. Those spores go on and make new fungi. Pretty simple. Except it's not. It's horribly, unbelievably complicated depending on like which fungi we're talking about. And this, I feel like I did the best I could to try to simplify this as much as I could in a very general scheme. For us as humans, our eggs and sperm do not exist outside of our body, right? We can't form half a baby and have it run off into the world. But fungi can do that. Their sort of asexual phase, they can produce spores, clonal spores, and spread around. And from an evolutionary standpoint, what that allows them to do is to maximize all the resources they're using right now around them at low cost, because asexual reproduction is cheap. You just double yourself, eat everything around you. You do sexual reproduction when you are looking towards the future. It's much more expensive and it takes longer, but you're shuffling up the cards, you're rolling the dice, and you're hoping that your genes will recombine in a way that helps you adapt to future situations. So fungi can live both in their asexual phase and the sexual phase. One is called the anamorph, one is called the teleomorph. A lot of molds and sort of like invisible things end up being anamorphs, and it's when things form a teleomorph that they become a more visible like mushroom. So within those 5 forms of fungi, there's a lot of shifting between forms. Some things will be like, a mold in one form and then a mushroom in another form. So an example of stuff like this is like cordyceps. Cordyceps tend to be a small mold that's kind of innocuous and is living as like an endophyte inside of plants, and even occasionally like parasitizing insects, but not forming a mushroom, cordyceps mushroom, until it actually mates with itself and then forms this like teleomorph. Examples of this too is something like, you guys are familiar with like a witch's butter, the jelly fungi. So in their teleomorphic form, it's a mushroom. In their anamorphic form, it's a yeast. And that yeast can actually cause human disease, which is pretty crazy, because I've touched a lot of those jelly mushrooms, and thankfully I haven't gotten whatever that disease is, but aware of it. There's also the idea of sexes in fungi being kind of different than it is in animals. Humans have like an X and a Y chromosome, so relatively, I mean, it gets much more complicated, but in a very basic sense, it's relatively simple. And yeast are also relatively simple. Yeast have, fungi in general don't have sexes, they have what are called mating types. It's like little kind of selections of genes, groups of genes that they trade back and forth. So yeast have A and alpha, and for a yeast to mate, an A and alpha have to get together. They send little pheromones to each other, and then they make a little, what's called a schmoo. So they kind of get together and like, oh, hey, we're gonna share. And then they mate. But that's really complicated by the fact that some fungi have like 23,000 mating types. So the split gill mushroom here is an example of one that is not a binary. It has 23,000 things, and it uses a tetrapole mating system where like 4 different pieces of the genome have to like cross over and exchange genetic information. And the reason why potentially it has so many of these different mating types and has so much complexity is because it's super adaptable. And that's the whole idea, is that when you have a lot of different genetic options, you're going to be really adaptable. So split gills are like all over the world. They're one of the most widespread mushrooms. And that sort of makes sense why they have like 23,000 mating types or genders, because they're just super adaptable. Okay, breakdown of fungal ecology. There's sort of 3 main modes. There's mutualism, where things are like getting along together, and examples of that would be like mycorrhizal fungi, lichenized fungi. Lichens are relatively symbiotic. In fact, the definition of symbiosis came from a female scientist who was studying lichens and suggested it, and up until that point, people had always said that like male biologists basically refused to acknowledge that there could be cooperation in nature. Everything had to be like fighting, and it took a woman to come along and be like, hey guys, things might actually be working together as symbiosis, and lichen was the test case for that. So. And like the animal digestive fungi that live inside of us, those are sort of symbiotic, right? They're helping us, we're helping them. The original sort of metabolic mode for fungi was being parasitic. And so a lot of things started as being parasitic. And again, one of the things you'll see is stuff switches between these modes, because fungi are ultimately very opportunistic. And they'll change their form, and they'll change their sort of trophic strategy, that the way they eat, based on what's best for them. And this is the idea that like, sure, can we get some mycelium to eat like oil in a lab? Yeah, but if we stick that mycelium out in nature, will it eat that oil? No, because it doesn't want to. It's gonna go do what's best for it. And this is a constant problem in a lot of our lives, where we want something to do something that we want it to, but that organism is gonna do what it wants to do. We see this all the time in like winemaking, where winemakers want something to happen, and the fungi is like, I don't want to do that. And then you have a problem in your fermentation. So, parasitic fungi, there's 2 flavors. You have necrotrophs, where the host dies, and a biotroph where the host lives. Necrotroph would be something like a cordyceps that tends to like kill its host, whereas a biotroph is something that lives on a host without necessarily affecting, it can affect the fitness, but it doesn't usually kill it. So an example of that, and I didn't actually get a photo of these in the book, but I really like it, is the beetle hangers. So these are essentially like little fungal STDs that beetles get. And they don't go inside, it's just like, kind of like genital warts for beetles, but they're fungal, and it's kind of neat. And then we have saprotrophs, and so this is when stuff is decaying, dead things. And again, this figure has examples of things that are switching between these different modes, right? So Xylaria is going to be living inside of plants as an endophyte, and then when the tree dies, they switch to being saprotrophic, and they eat the dead tree. Honey mushrooms have a tendency to like kill the tree they're on and then become saprotrophic. And then I mentioned that we have yeast all over our skin and our scalps, Malassezia. And so that loves to, it's generally a good thing that we have it all over ourselves, because something else worse would be on us if that wasn't there. But it is the same thing that causes all sorts of skin problems. So like tinea versicolor, lightening of skin, dandruff, an overgrowth of that yeast means you now have a rash. And so it's all about like the balance and the way that these things are interacting within a system as to whether or not they're going to be problematic for us. And a lot of that is understanding the balance and the sort of the larger ecosystem and structure that these fungi are a part of. Okay, so one of the big things I did with this book is I wanted to try to put forth a different narrative on mycelium and mycorrhizal interactions. And so you guys may have heard, mycelium is the internet of nature. It's a good gateway concept, but it's just not true, and it's not descriptive of the kind of the complexity, the nuance, and the competition that is happening in nature, particularly. So I reached out to Toby Kears, who's a really amazing mycelium researcher, and asked her to give me some feedback, actually write a little blurb in the book. And I sent her what I had written, and she was like, Gordon, this isn't good enough. This sounds like you're trying to say that mycelium is the internet of nature. And I was like, oh, I was trying to be really critical, and she was like, not critical enough. So I was like, okay, the number one mycelium researcher in the world told me to do better. So I went back in and read some more papers and did some more work, and finally got to the point that she was like, okay, I'm comfortable with what you've written, I will give you a little thing. But Toby introduced me to the idea of what they call the mycelium marketplace. And this is, instead of just thinking that who's seen Fantastic Fungi and that version of the tree that has all of the kind of the glowing roots going out in all directions and there's nutrients going back and forth, that's just not true. At least we don't have the data to say that's true. There's some limited data that says in forests of trees that are all essentially clonal copies of each other, that there is some nutrient sharing between those trees. The point has also been made in several papers that that nutrient sharing will happen regardless of the mycelium being there, and that things just diffuse through soil and trees are able to pick stuff up. It's probably facilitated by mycelium, but is it really a conscious sharing, kumbaya, underground community kind of, that is the issue. And there was a paper put out, and this is as close as scientists get to giving an actual smackdown, but the positive citation biases and over-interpreted results lead to misinformation on common mycorrhizal networks in forests. And so that is a way of sort of saying, we reject the notion that the nutrients are just being shared, in this very communal kind of way. And instead what it's getting at is there is an economy for trees and fungi in the soil. Every tree is an individual. And so a tree that is down in a valley versus a tree that is up on a ridgeline are gonna have very different needs. So they might be the exact same species of tree, but the one in the valley has access to all sorts of water and nutrients, whereas the one up on the ridgeline has, it's very poor soil, not a lot of cover, tons of wind. So they need to carry a different portfolio of fungi, just like if you and I went to a stock a financial advisor, they'd say, well, we have different needs, right? So I'm gonna set you up with these stocks versus these stocks kind of thing. So trees are actively trying to get something that fits their needs, and fungi are paying attention to what those trees are offering. And this brings me to the idea of, and I learned this from actually going over the Sonoma grants, and I love being on the scholarship committee because I get to read all the grant applications we get from students, and it's helped me learn a lot because I didn't actually study mycology for my PhD, I studied wine fermentations. And there was a paper talking about kind of high risk, high reward, or low risk, low reward mushrooms. And I thought this was a great concept, that Lactarius and Russell mushrooms tend to be very cheap for trees to carry. They don't require a whole lot of nitrogen or a whole lot of sugars from the tree. Fungi return the nitrogen. But they're low risk, low reward. So a lot of trees carry Russula and Lactarius because it doesn't cost much. And you're cool, we'll just keep them around. Something like porcini can eat up to 5 to 10% of the sugar that the tree is making. So it's a high risk, high reward, but porcini can go out and find nitrogen for you. So they can actually actively go forage in a way that Lactarius never could. And I was like, that's a really cool concept. It also really gets into my head when you think about foraging and you're trying to be where are the trees that are stressed for nutrients, because maybe those would be the ones that are more likely to have porcini underneath them, right? So really what I want to get at is just the idea that there are a lot more going on here underground, especially when we're mixed forests of deciduous trees and coniferous trees. And we have different types of mycelium as well, because there's arbuscular versus ectomycorrhizal. Arbuscular mycorrhizae is associated with 80-90% of plants on the planet. It doesn't form mushrooms. Those are the Zygomycetes filamentous fungi, and then there's the ectomycorrhizal, which do form mushrooms, but that's only associated with 1 to 2% of all trees. And so that's a relatively small percentage of stuff, but those are the ones we really like because they form mushrooms, specifically stuff like porcini and chanterelles, etc. Okay, so climate change is happening, whether we like it or not. It's gonna keep getting hotter, and things aren't gonna get better anytime soon. So we should really look at what we can do to help buffer some of this. And fungi are going to be one of the main sort of allies we have in trying to offset some of the horrific, climate change stuff that's happening. One of the big things we can do is really look at them in our food systems and our medicine systems. So mushrooms are an insanely sustainable form of agriculture. They allow us to recycle agricultural waste and make protein, and they have a very, very low water footprint and space footprint compared to a lot of other foods and very low power inputs. So it's really good food, and it's really cheap to make. So we should be shunting a lot more resources towards growing mushrooms and fungi. Especially the thing I like about them is they can be very democratic. And the best mushroom farms are often like the closest one. And I don't think we should necessarily move towards like giant, farms. We should just get lots of local farms, because that's how we support sort of a healthy, human ecosystem as well. And mushrooms are they're really good to eat. I get a lot of questions about like which ones are the best to eat, and I say it's not about one that is good or bad, it's about eating a lot of different kinds and getting a diversity of stuff in your diet. To me, the biggest nutrient in mushrooms isn't the protein, it's not the carbs, it's not the micronutrients, it's just the fiber. We are all in like a massive fiber devoid desert. We don't eat enough fiber, and fungal fiber is really, really good for our guts because it helps stimulate like immune function and lowers inflammation, all this kind of stuff. I wrote about medicinal mushrooms quite a bit in the book, but I'm not going to talk about them in this talk. But one thing I do want to point out is that beyond the promise of medicinal mushrooms, because I think they're great, but I think they're also like severely overhyped, and the way that they're sold and marketed is like tantamount to fraud. But we have a lot of actual drugs and therapies we've gotten from fungi. So everyone in this room has probably taken penicillin some point in their life, and that's from fungi. The Plaxetel, or Taxol, is the person who's famous for saying his mother was cured by, her breast cancer was cured by turkey tail. This is the drug she actually took. This is what saved her. And it's derived from a fungal endophyte that lived inside the Pacific yew tree. And to me, that's really cool. That's worth celebrating. That's worth talking about. Statins are a thing that lower cholesterol. There's a lot of those in mushrooms. You can eat oyster mushrooms, you can eat shiitake, but it was originally isolated from aspergillus, which is a filamentous mold. And then anyone who's ever had an organ transplant is probably taking cyclosporin, which is an immune suppressant produced by Tolipocladium, which is a sort of cordyceps-like fungi that here is growing on a deer truffle, Elaphomyces. I know we've found them at Soma forays and stuff like that. But it produces this immune suppressor to suppress the immune system of the thing it's infecting, and we use this now as a really important therapy and drug in our own world. So I think fungi are neat. But one of the things that happens is when we look at fungi and we say, what are they going to do for us? We forget to say, well, what can we do for them, right? If it's an ally thing, this has got to be a two-way street. So it can't just be that fungi are doing stuff for us and we're harvesting them from the world. We have to figure out the ways that we can help them. And unfortunately, there's a lot of threats to mushrooms and fungi. The one that's not a threat is foragers, right? Foragers have not hunted chanterelles to extinction. Humans hunted a whole lot of other stuff to extinction, but we haven't made chanterelles go extinct because we picked too many. And things that are affecting the number of mushrooms and affecting the sort of biodiversity are much bigger issues of like global climate change, habitat loss, shifting weather patterns, all these things that are sort of beyond the level of the individual. And they're things that like governments and corporations should be held responsible for. I don't think we're gonna see that anytime soon, but that's, as a mushroom forager, I get shamed a lot. People are like, you don't think it's really responsible to teach people about like how to go forage mushrooms? There's not enough out there already. And I'm like, it's not about people going hunting mushrooms. It's about the fact that like a Walmart just came in and plowed down an entire forest to build another parking lot, or like a developer wants to get rid of this nice little strip of riparian habitat. That's the kind of thing we need to rage against. So I think one of the things we can do is get activated and get motivated and get organized about trying to do conservation. There's great projects here in California, like the Fundus organization, Tay and Hart, and lots of other people are involved in like sampling and showing all the different types of fungi that are in California, and then they become part of like a diversity survey. If they're gonna build something, you gotta go out and see what fungi are there and know, well, are these rare? Are these, is it okay if we build something here? Are we gonna impact, special populations? There's also the idea of bioremediation, which I think is a really fun idea, but it's one that's been sort of overpromised, a little bit like the medicinal mushroom thing, where, again, you can't just take oyster mushroom mycelium and throw it on an oil spill and expect it's gonna get cleaned up. What you have to do is you have to go to an area that's polluted, you have to sample, figure out what's growing there, and then take that back to a lab, do some optimization on that strain, and then like maybe even monkey around with it a little bit genetically, or just like try to get the best version of that strain, and then reapply it back out into the environment, and recognize that it's not going to be just the action of one organism, it'll probably be one of those like multi-succession type things. And when it comes to bioremediation, it may even require us to do special like digesters, right? If we got a bunch of tanks in a row and we threw a bunch of plastics in one end, fungi can eat plastics, but they usually just make more microplastics. They're not necessarily digesting stuff down to like reusable goo. So you might have to take one tank, transfer it to the next tank, and use some archaea or bacteria or like special conditions to help the digestion. I think it's possible, but it's not as simple as just like throwing an old mushroom kit out and like expecting that to clean up radioactive waste or something like that. So this is one of the things that we can help fungi by getting a better sense of what's going on. There's also the sort of the top-down approach, and this is one of the things I got Juliana Furci to write about in the book, was her 3F Fungi Foundation initiative. And this is, you guys are all familiar with flora and fauna, but we're trying to add the word funga to sort of legislation and conservation language as well, at a governmental level around the world. So it's not just like a bunch of grassroots organizers being like, we love mushrooms. No, it's from the top down, they're getting governments to agree to use words like funga and include that in those environmental assessment surveys. And so I'm really pumped on what is happening with fungal conservation, and we're moving towards it, but there's been absolutely nothing. So there's also like, doing something is better than nothing, but there's a long way to go in terms of getting people to care about mushrooms and fungi, and we may lose a lot of biodiversity before we even have a chance to like catalog it. So in the sense of mushrooms being sustainability, I talked a little bit about the mushroom circular economy, and this is just the idea that like everything we do as humans generally creates waste, and fungi and nature are really good at using up waste. So everything we do could essentially be augmented, and having fungi present there to like provide food and medicine materials. How many guys know that like all of the laundry detergent you uses fungal enzymes? We've been doing this for like 50 plus years. Most people have no idea, but that's a form of biotechnology that's been going on for a very long time. And there's a ton more like fungal enzymes and things that are produced by fungi in like industrial settings that are helping make human life better. It clearly has big impacts on agriculture, and if we started doing sort of more sustainable forms of agriculture, we could rely on fungi instead of pumping out huge amounts of inorganic nitrogen and using tons of pesticides. There's things like bio-better products where you can create like a fungal spray and spray endophytes on plants that will protect them from disease or drought instead of just spraying chemicals all over them. And there's a potential for using them in energy as well, and really remediating soils. And so there's a lot of good stuff that comes out of fungi. Okay, so the science lecture is done. I am now going to talk about mushrooms, so you can relax. And this is a little bit what the book is like, because the first 10 chapters are kind of intense and it's a lot of stuff, but I don't expect people to read it all the way through. I just want you to jump around, see a question, get an answer, but that's a little bit like what the first half of the book is about. The second half of the book is really about mushrooms, because that's generally what people care most about, and what I care most about, because I like eating them. So what is mushroom? It's essentially a temporary, structure created to disperse spores, and usually sexual spores. And that's kind of the core definition of what a mushroom is it's something that lets spores out into the world. And some of them, last like a day, some of them can last for years, but in essence, the purpose of the mushroom is to help that fungus reproduce. And so again, when people are like, well, what does this mushroom do? I'm like, it doesn't have to do anything. It's a mushroom. It produces spores. That's what it does. Anything else it does for us is incidental, and it doesn't take away from its value as it being a living organism, because it's already doing what it does, regardless of what it does for us. Okay, so in the book, you will always see mushroom anatomy represented as an Amanita muscaria, usually, or some kind of amanita, which is great, except that amanitas are not like a morphological blueprint for all mushrooms. Most mushrooms don't have a vulva. A lot of things don't have a ring or an annulus. Most mushrooms don't actually have the warts on top. So people learn about like the shape and morphology of mushroom without actually getting a sense of what mushrooms look like. And I get a lot of questions from people where they send me stuff and say, is this a mushroom? I'm like, no, that's insulation foam. Or people are like, hey, what plant is this? I'm like, that's a mushroom. But it's people not recognizing what's fungal because they haven't seen different types of fungi. So that's why I included sort of this overview of both, this is Kingdom Dicaria with Basidios and Ascos. Also, that's my shorthand, Basidios and Ascos. But I showed a polypore, I showed some gastroid mushrooms, I showed both a cup and a flask fungi. So I'm trying to get people to think a little bit more broadly too about what constitutes a mushroom. I had a conversation last week where someone's like, yeah, but morels aren't mushrooms. And I was like, no, they are, at least the way I define them, as being something, a fruiting body that's producing spores. And you can argue semantically back and forth, but I think if we hunt them as mushrooms, then we should count them as mushrooms. And I think it makes things a lot easier if we sort of just count Ascos and Basidios together as forming mushrooms, instead of trying to delineate one as fungus and the other one as mushrooms. So, to that end, here are my sort of 16 morphological sort of category types that I came up with. In the book, each one of these types has a whole bunch of like genre names associated with it too, so you can go dive in and like see what genre are in there. But these are morphological types, so these are not based on genetics, and that's a really cool thing in fungi. You'll see lots of stuff converging on the same form and function, so all tooth fungi are not related, right? They've evolved teeth because it's a great way of producing lots of surface area, but they're from different genetic lineages. And so one of the things I encourage people to do is to like look at the morphological section and then open up the inner cover of the book where there's a big taxonomic table. And you can compare what's similar in a morphological sense to like where things are coming from genetically. And again, this may not be a thing you do unless you're super nerdy, but you can do it with my book, and that's never been a thing that you can do with any other book. So I think it's kind of neat. I hate dichotomous keys, and I didn't want to put one in here, and so instead I put the taxonomic table. But this is my like kind of as close as I got to a dichotomous key of trying to figure out like, are you above ground, are you below ground, what is your basic form, and like what category of mushroom should you be looking at. Okay, so mushrooms can grow everywhere. They're on the ground, they grow on wood, they grow on insects, they can even grow on other mushrooms. That's a powder top growing on an old dead russula. Here's like a really cool cordyceps that Damon found. There's some mushrooms that grow in tropical climates, the little bristly cups, and there's ones that grow in cold climates, like the enoki can grow in cold climates. We have truffles that grow in the desert, and there's a surprising number of mushrooms that are sort of like desert specialists. And traditionally, these have really been only seen growing in like the Middle East, and I think there's someone trying to cultivate them. They don't taste like a black truffle, they're not intensely sulfury, but they were apparently like sweet and kind of nutty like a potato, and I was like, I'm really interested in eating that. And someone told me very recently that they have these in Arizona. So I was like, oh, that's neat. I want to eat one of these from Arizona. There's even a mushroom that grows underwater. And there's a couple of different Asco cups and things that grow underwater, but this is like the first like Basidiomycete, like gill mushroom that was seen to grow underwater, Staphylococcus aquatica. And originally it was, I think, found in the Rogue River in Oregon. And then a couple years ago I was down in San Diego, and it was a really wet year, and someone was talking about having found it in LA. And I was like, well, that's really cool. That extends like the range of the species by a couple thousand miles. And then last summer I was in Pennsylvania and giving this presentation, and someone was like, hey, we just found that mushroom here, or like a version of that mushroom here in Pennsylvania. And I was like, shit, maybe aquatic mushroom is actually way more common than we thought. We just haven't been looking underwater for mushrooms, because that's not typically where we look for mushrooms. But it's just kind of cool that like they can seep into every different habitat on Earth, and I love that. There's a lot of cool ways they can grow. I cover some of these in the sort of fungal phenomena section in the back. There's fairy rings, and fairy rings are not a portal to another dimension. It is not the Fey realm, I hate to tell you, but it is a big patch of mycelium, and there's mushrooms growing around the outside. Well, if you're on enough mushrooms, it'll get you there, I'm sure. We have rhizomorphs, which are what honey mushrooms use to creep up in between the bark and the cambium, the living tissue of a tree, and they girdle it, and then they kill it, and they eat it. So rhizomorphs are kind of like the evil cousin of mycelium, in that it's like all melanized and hard and can survive above the surface of the soil. We have gravitropism, so this is where there was turkey tail growing on a log, and the log got flipped, so all that new growth is now orienting down towards the ground, so spores will always orient, so they're falling down with gravity. Who knows what, did this just die? Okay. Who knows what that big black lump is? Chaga. Is chaga a mushroom?
No.
No, chaga's a sterile conch, and it's a big sclerotia. So sclerotia are kind of like it's like almost like a mushroom potato. It's not actually producing a mushroom, but it's storing a lot of energy. So they're packed with carbohydrates and oils, and usually they have a lot of melanin too to help them kind of resist, UV damage. Morels, to form a morel, it has to form a sclerotia first. So this is like an interesting phenomenon that we should all think about a little bit more, especially if we're one to hunt morels, because that's one of those things you gotta keep in mind. Rose combing, I just told you guys about gravitropism, right, where gills orient down. Gravitropism is when gills are growing up on the top side of a mushroom. We don't know why that happens, and it doesn't really make sense. You see it a lot with stuff like chanterelles and hedgehogs, mushrooms that tend to grow for a long time, maybe localized humidity, pH. Some people have suggested it's because of soil contamination or pollution. In really extreme examples, you can actually get double-decker mushrooms. So I've seen this before. I've seen Lactarius too, where there's a whole new mushroom growing to the top of the mushroom, like anti-gravity kind of thing. You're like, all right, we don't know why it's doing that. We have a lot of tiny mushrooms. There's a plethora of super tiny mushrooms. And again, the line where you draw between mold versus mushroom is it's unclear, and there's still a lot of arguments about what constitutes a mushroom in on the tiny side of things. But on the big side of things, we have some really massive mushrooms. This one is called Macrocide titans, and it grows usually in subtropical areas. That's not a Photoshop picture. That is a real Mexican mycologist. He's not a big dude, but he's 5'4" or something like that. But that mushroom is very large. And I'd really love to see people cultivating that, because can you imagine going to the farmer's market and coming home with a little umbrella mushroom that you can then, it's also edible, so you can eat it for dinner. Super cool. There's also, you can find maitake that are 120 pounds, just giant things. So there's some really, truly massive mushrooms out there. Okay, how many of you guys have asked, is this edible before? Everyone has at some point, right? And I have never been as scared with a group of adults as I have been on a mushroom foray, when people are just constantly can I eat this? Can I eat this? Can I eat this? And you're like, dude, what are you, a toddler? Do you have to put everything in your mouth? Slow down. And the big thing is trying to get people to recognize that edibility is not a binary yes or no. It is a spectrum of desirability. And so to that end, in reverence of the great David Aurora, who was up here a month ago, and he was like, God, who writes choice? What a weird word usage. And we're like, yeah, David, we agree. So I, instead of using the word choice edible, which has never made any sense to me, I was like, let's give it a 5-star rating, because I think a lot of people inherently understand that. So 5 stars is the incredible, 4 is great, 3 is good, 2 is fair, mediocre. 1 is kind of a technically edible, non-toxic. And then there's things that are special preparation. So this might be something that is toxic, but you can boil it and make it safe to eat. Or something that is like a turkey tail, really, really difficult to try to chew. So instead you dry it out and you powder it, and then it's a medicinal thing. So that's me trying to add a little bit of nuance to this, is it edible? Yes, no. And now on a foray, I explain this, and then when people come to me and say, can I eat this? I say, well, that's a 1 star. Do you really want to eat that? And it's helping people bin things a little bit more effectively than just kind of yes, you can eat this, but why would you kind of thing. And I usually ask people well, smell it. Do you want to eat this moldy thing? Is that really what you want to put in your mouth right now? If you look up the definition of edible in a dictionary, it says suitable to be eaten. So, as much as I love Terry Pratchett, the phrase, all mushrooms are edible, some only once, clever joke, but it's so tired. And it's also wildly incorrect. Usually when people say that, I'm like, cool, I'm going to sit here while you eat a Ganoderma. I'll wait, go ahead and eat a nice big conch for me. We are sort of out of the winter season, but some of the mushrooms that were up here were the winter trio. So black trumpets, yellowfeet, hedgehogs are plentiful, easy to ID, and those are all part of the sort of beginner, easy edible section that I put in the book. Candy caps are a little bit harder to hunt because there are lookalikes, but they're also a phenomenal mushroom that has amazing aroma and smell like maple syrup. I really love foraging for mushrooms because it connects us to the seasons. We're in the spring season, so right now, if you go up the mountains, you have a chance to find morels. You may not find that many, but you might find some. You might also get totally skunked. At the end of this, if you have patience, I will give you my tips on morel hunting. In the summer, you can go up to Humboldt, where there's lots of fog, and hunt chanterelles and lobster mushrooms, and it's phenomenal. In the fall, if we get a nice like rain in September, good chance we're going to see porcini about 2 to 3 weeks later under some pine habitat. In the winter, again, we go out and we can hunt the winter trio as well as all sorts of other fun stuff like jelly babies and little jelly tongues and some straggler matsutake and things like that. So when you're out foraging, and especially if you're posting about mushrooms online, you may run into this debate. And this, to me, is a very silly debate, but it is one that continues to sort of rage on to no end. And this is a misunderstanding that people have that somehow they think that taking a mushroom and cutting it on the bottom versus just picking it out is going to be less damaging to the mycelium. And there's a couple like misconceptions there. A lot of people who say this will say, you shouldn't uproot the mushroom. And I usually say, well, mushrooms don't have roots, they have mycelium. And people are like, what is semantics, whatever. And I don't disagree with the idea that like when we pick a mushroom, we want to try to minimize the disturbance to the substrate below, to the mycelium that's there. In the book, I describe my best practices, which is generally like, I pick a lot of mushrooms because stuff like porcini, chanterelles, there tends to be a fair bit of edible mushroom down on the stem. So I take it out and I'll like trim that part off, put it back in the hole, cover the whole thing up, and keep moving. When you're doing a video where I'm just tapping mushrooms and pulling them out, that is hard to communicate to people because they, you have their attention for like half a second. So I have this argument a lot. There is also the idea that when you cut a mushroom, you're now leaving the base of that mushroom exposed to pathogens that could enter in through the base of the cut stem and get down to the mycelium. And so there was some preliminary data from like an Oregon study that sort of said, cutting chanterelles may actually be worse for them than picking them. And so I think like on either side of the issue, just do what you feel is right in the situation. The only real data we have for this was like a 30-year study that was done in Switzerland, and there was another like 14-year companion study that was done in Norway where they showed cutting versus plucking versus controls across like, different sites. And there was no significant difference. There was ups and downs in each year, but they really didn't see a difference in the number of mushrooms or the diversity of species as a function of harvesting method. What they did see a difference on was that compaction of soil led to less mushroom fruiting bodies. And if you guys have been to Salt Point recently, you will know that Salt Point has just been walked over so hard, and there's still plenty of mushrooms there, but it does make me upset to see so many people going to just one spot when people could be going to lots of different spots. And we don't need people driving up from San Jose to go to Salt Point. We need them going where they can go hunt that's closer to them, so we're not over-trafficking one area. And I'd like to see that kind of thinking brought a little bit more to the forefront when we're talking about mushroom conservation. And also, not shaming foragers for what they're doing, because a lot of times, like, foragers are out there as sort of the first line of defense for like, hey, I spotted this invasive plant, or like, oh, I saw something and I yanked it out because I know it doesn't belong here. Foragers are not the enemy in conservation, and I think that's a thing that needs to be recognized. I'm preaching to the choir here, but yeah. Recognizable edible mushrooms. You guys know what most of these things are. This is our state mushroom. I got a chance to go into the Capitol and like tell them to adopt this, and they did it. I would have preferred they chose Omphallotus, but this is what people voted on. Here is our Grand Edulus under pine. Here's a butterbelly. This is the one that grows in the fall, but there's a spring one that's really good. I love those. Lobster mushrooms are pretty tasty. Lion's mane are great. Chicken of the woods out here is not really the best edible mushroom because it can make you kind of sick. I tend to eat a lot of it off eucalyptus, and I've never gotten sick, but I just cook the absolute crap out of it. You can do that with a lot of mushrooms. Just cook them really well, and you have a lot lower chance of having any kind of GI upset. Cauliflower sporassus mushroom, I think, is an elite, edible, super tasty mushroom. They've started cultivating that in China, and I'd really like to see that happen here. That's a thing the cultivation committee could get involved in, is maybe trying to bring some unusual varieties isolated here in California into culture, get them handed off to a commercial operation. And then morels are delicious, and that's what we're probably hunting this time of year. When it comes to mushroom cleaning and cooking, there's a lot of debate. And it's a stupid debate because some people are really like hung up on the idea of like never getting the mushrooms wet, which is very silly to me because mushrooms exist in nature and they get rained on all the time. And I don't know why suddenly when you pick them and bring them home, you can't get them wet anymore. And I think part of that is Julia Child's advice on cooking mushrooms, which says, don't get your mushrooms wet. and then like don't crowd the pan, put them in a lot of oil or butter. And I think a lot of people here know where I'm going with this, because the best way to cook a mushroom is to clean it thoroughly, because if there's any dirt on there, it's gonna taste like dirt. So wash your mushrooms, especially stuff like chanterelles. And if you really want them to be drier before you cook them, you can put them in like a salad spinner. You can let them sit out and air dry for a little while. Or you just put them in wet, and then you don't add any oil or butter. You do what's called a dry saute, and you let all that water cook out, because mushrooms are kind of like a sponge. You got to squeeze that sponge, get all that water out before you start adding fat. Otherwise, you end up with these really like slippery, wet, insipid mushrooms, and that's kind of what a lot of people complain. I don't like mushrooms; they're too slippery. And like, well, it's because people have been cooking them wrong your whole life, right? Sometimes with commercial mushrooms, when they are really dry, they're not going to have a whole lot of water in them. So instead of doing a wet saute or a dry saute, you do a wet saute. We actually add a little bit of water in and kind of steam them down. And once they're steamed down, then you can start frying them in like oil or butter, get them crispy. And I really like sort of, you know, brushing and wiping, that's what I do in the field, maybe, or sort of an initial thing. A lot of stuff I'm either gonna like wash and scrub, so like porcini, amanitas, things that are relatively big and relatively solid, I'll wash and scrub them because they're not super dirty and they just need a little bit of like, you know, get the visible dirt off. But something like morels, black trumpets, highly textural mushrooms that have a lot of like nooks and crannies, those are things you gotta soak. And instead of soaking them once in salt water for like 48 hours, people have all sorts of very weird ideas, especially about morels. I think it's best to just kind of soak them a couple different times. You can put salt in once if you want, but if you put salt in every single wash, you're just wasting salt. So I just like to wash them until the water runs clean, you know, like washing rice kind of thing. Stuff like black trumpets here, it often helps to kind of like break them in half because there's usually junk in the middle. Get it out. You know, a lot of different cooking preps for mushrooms. There's a tremendous, you know, amount of kind of cooking theory that can go into a mushroom. And I think every mushroom could potentially be treated differently depending on how you want to experience its texture, its flavor, you know, what are you trying to maximize. I love doing multi-step cooking things, and a lot of times I start it with just a dry saute, and then later on I'll add it into other cooking things. So for many of my mushrooms, the first step I do is either just a quick boil or a quick pan fry. And then you look at like, well, what else can I do to kind of like take this dish to the next level by integrating these mushrooms with different cooking techniques. And you can do interesting stuff like smoke them or, you know, wrap them in parchment. This is actually great for matsutake, wrapping them in like parchment with some sauce. And so it's sort of, some things you may not want to brown them really well, right? Some mushrooms are delicious brown, but for me, porcini get really bitter when you brown them. So you want to think about like what cooking techniques and how you're applying heat to a mushroom. And when it comes to preservation, it's also a great time to think about like, what else can I do, right? I dry a lot of mushrooms, but something like a chanterelle doesn't get better when you dry it. You lose all the flavor and you lose the texture, and it doesn't become more strongly flavored. Like morels, shiitake, porcini all get more intense flavor when you dry them, whereas chanterelles kind of just, you know, they lose a lot of their appeal. So I like to like cook and freeze chanterelles as opposed to drying them. And you think about this with different kinds of mushrooms. Matsutake aren't great when you dry them because they lose their texture and they lose their smell. Cooking and freezing them is okay, but the smell doesn't really stick around. And what I find is best for matsutake is actually doing like a liquid infusion. So I'll take matsutake and cover them in sake and then add some sugar and salt and a little MSG, and I make my own sort of matsutake mirin, which then can stay good in the fridge, you know, for pretty much a whole year. And I can use that liquid and bring some of that same matsutake character into the food I cook. And it's, you know, really fun to play around, especially with like candying and making syrups with mushrooms. Chanterelles are great candied. I like doing yellowfeet candied. Pickled mushrooms are great, lacto-fermenting. So this is like the mycophagy chapter. I'm trying to get people to think about like all different ways to prepare mushrooms. But since we talked about mushrooms we can eat, we gotta be worried about mushrooms that are poisonous. I don't need to tell you guys that much about all of these because you're relatively familiar, I'm hoping, with our toxic mushrooms. Amanita muscaria is the one that is like edible, toxic, trippy all at the same time. It doesn't contain amatoxins, but the destroying angel and death cap do. A lot of people have a misconception that poisonous mushrooms are going to be super colorful, and outside of Amanita muscaria, most of them are kind of drab. So I don't use color as necessarily like an indicator of, you know, what's toxic and what's not. That being said, the Satan's bolete, Rubra boletus, is toxic, and there's no amount of cooking that's going to make that one safe. So there are some edible red-pored boletes here in California that are actually not bad. I'd put them at like a 2-star, likely. You know, but you don't want to go hunt red port boletes unless you really know what you're doing. Geromitra are also like relatively toxic. In some Nordic countries, they will like double boil them and then eat them. I don't recommend you do that because even like the tiniest amount of that toxin can still like cause long-term damage. And there's been a whole cluster of like ALS patients in Switzerland who ate a bunch of Geromitra. That being said, there's a whole other clade of Geromitra, the Geromitra montana, these sort of big ones that are a little bit lighter brown, they're a lot bigger. And as far as I know, they do not contain any of the toxin, and they're totally safe to cook and eat like you would a morel. You do want to cook them thoroughly, but they're not problematic. Jack-o'-lantern is one I was hoping would be our state mushroom, because this is like such a cool mushroom. It really grows in California. It glows in the dark. You can use it to dye fabrics. It'll stain your hands orange, and this is actually one of the few mushrooms I recommend not touching a lot with your hands. I don't think it's bad to touch it a little bit, but I wouldn't pick one up and carry it around for a whole hike, because not good. You don't need to read this, but I did a lot of work on trying to figure out what are the toxins in mushrooms, and it was I was really hoping it would be like as simple as this slide, right? No, it was a lot of digging into papers and looking at onset speeds and treatments and other stuff like this. So one of the things I thought was sort of interesting was particularly auricularia, wood ear. Anyone heard of Chinese restaurant syndrome? It was a thing when people ate too much Chinese food, they would get sick, and they blamed it on MSG. It's not MSG. It was actually eating too much wood ear, because it's a what does it do? It inhibits blood clotting. I want to say it's a vasodilator, and I'd have to ask Damon. I know Damon was eating a lot of auricularia when he had COVID, and he said it like was relieving the symptoms or something like that. Anyhow, there's a bunch of weird stuff you get poisoned by in mushrooms, and some of that can be allayed by like cooking it really well. But sometimes you might just want to be aware of like, hey, maybe I shouldn't eat wood ears, like, an entire pile of wood ears every day for like 3 weeks, because you might start to feel bad. That gets back to my point of like, eating a diversity of mushrooms is good for you. Eating one thing all the time is inherently just not that great for you. If you're an adult and all you do is eat chicken fingers, like, grow up. Okay, vividly colorful mushrooms are not toxic. They're just really pretty. I have a section in the book where I talk about some like the pigments and stuff that are in them. I talked about like UV reactive mushrooms versus bioluminescence. So fluorescence is when you shine a light, and that light excites electrons in those mushrooms, and as those mushrooms come back down in energy state, they shoot out light at a different wavelength. So fluorescence, you have to add light to get light, and these mushrooms are producing, some different shade of light depending on like the compound that's in that mushroom. And so fluorescence is really fun to get a fluorescent light and walk around the woods. And it feels like there's this whole hidden world that you suddenly have access to because you have a light that shines this sort of secret thing. And it's especially cool at night because some things will just light up like a candle. Stuff like scorpions, millipedes, like glow really bright blue. There's a lot of lichens that glow really like yellow and orange. And it's also a great tool for identification too, because you can look at something and say, well, I think it might be this. And if you pull out the UV light and you shine it and it glows, you're like, oh yeah, that's definitely a Cortinarius or something like that. Bioluminescence is different because these mushrooms are actually making their own light all the time in the same way that a jellyfish is producing its own light. And so it's sort of a constant signal, but usually that's a very low level of light coming up from those mushrooms. So a lot of times you need to do long exposure photography. I just really like guttation. I think it's cool. This is when mushrooms are growing so fast they essentially sweat. And like, we don't really know why they do this. There's been some theory that like when they're at this stage, they're really prone to like, if a bug comes by and munches on them, they get hurt. So like maybe that stops them from getting munched on. There's a lot of cool mushroom aromas. I mentioned candy caps. They smell like maple. There's the Prince, which smells like almonds. Matsutake had this sort of like cinnamon, frozen orange juice concentrate. Cedar wax cap is Hart's favorite mushroom. It smells really good. I put that in tincture. Smells great. The stinky squid is one of the nastiest smelling mushrooms I've ever found. It smells like a dead body. With all this stuff, I wanted to put a mushroom aroma wheel in the book. So I come from the world of wine, and this was my attempt at trying to add some language to when you pick up a mushroom and you don't know how to describe the smell, other than say, well, it smells kind of mushroomy. I'm like, well, cool. Here's a whole list of descriptors. with sort of a central thing where you can say, well, of the earth, and these are mushroomy things. But then maybe it's more chemical, or it's stinky, or it's like vegetal, where on the spectrum of stuff are you falling? The idea of the aroma wheel is just to give you a little bit more vocabulary to talk about the stuff. I ended the book by talking about mycoheterotrophic plants, because these are plants that don't do photosynthesis. Instead, they get all of their energy from the mycelial network, and they're just really cool looking. Some of them, specifically this one, can be an indicator for Matsutake. So if you're out this time of year and you see Allotropa, you are in Matsutake habitat, and you should go back there next fall. There's also slime molds, which are not fungi, but really cool looking, and you find them a lot when you're out mushroom foraging. I'm gonna turn the volume down here. You don't need music for that, but this is me setting up my phone in time lapse, and it's just like pulsing. It's called cytoplasmic streaming. I got a lot of videos on Instagram if you want to see more of those, but they go from sort of amorphous plasmodium into these more specific sporangia, which are like what mature and then disperse the spores. I am going to be going to Mexico this September, beginning of October. It's going to be a really cool trip with Zach Mazzi and his partner Kim, and we're going to do some really cool stuff like learn how to make natural textiles and using like mushrooms as dyes. We're going to do a chocolate making workshop. There's a lot of mushroom cookery going on, and if anyone is interested in joining, you can check out thefungivore.com. It should be a really cool trip, and I think there's a couple spots left. And I'm going to thank you guys for listening and being here. And if anyone has questions, I will take questions, but I also want to really quickly run you through some morel stuff, because originally that's what I promised I would do. So, does anyone have a question? I know there was a lot. Yes, shoot.
Well, the person who said morel is not a mushroom, what did they say?
There's this is a pretty common thing that a lot of people think, that only basidiomycetes form mushrooms, because a lot of books still sort of say this, and they'll say, well, Ascomycete cups are a fungus. But you'll see a lot of stuff too, like jellies are often referred to as fungus, but they're a basidiomycete, so it's like a really inconsistent. What I wanted to do was just say, let's call it all mushrooms, since they're all. If most people will recognize that a morel is a mushroom. If you're going to recognize that a morel is a mushroom and a truffle is a mushroom, then everything in Ascomycota is also potentially a mushroom. Trichoderma form fire coral. Really cool little, that's one of the few things you probably shouldn't touch a lot of as a mushroom. But it's a mushroom. And then you start realizing, oh man, a lot of trichoderma form things that look kind of like mushrooms, little pin cushions and stuff like that. And you're like, well, trichoderma is definitely a mold, but that's why I introduced the idea of the anamorph and the teleomorph. Because now when we talk about ascos, it's the teleomorph form is what is actually forming the mushroom. Everything else, and there's one basidiomycete that forms an anamorph. I saw it this summer. It's in the chanterelle family, and it's like weird little red jelly stuff on a log. That's an anamorphic form of a chanterelle, basically. And I was like, that's really cool. You don't see a lot of that, but there's examples of it. So.
Okay, other one
Shoot.
was, did you put poker in there, and how many stars did you give?
I put in a section on Caesars and Vaginate, because it's in the advanced edible section, and I didn't want to not say that amanitas are, they can be both toxic and edible. And if you can recognize the section, because all of section Caesare and all of section Vaginate are edible, so I talked about the sort of recognizing those, versus section Phalloideae, where they're all toxic. And then you have section like Validae, where it's kind of mixed toxicity. I think a lot of Validae are edible, they just have to be cooked really well first. And then there's a few other sections that are again, variable edibility and toxicity. I would give Cocra a 2, generously. I do not like that mushroom. But some people do. The thing I did in my book is I courted controversy by giving chanterelles and porcini 4 stars. And I'm like, come fight me, bro. I just don't like them that much. I think they're great, but I didn't think they were worthy of a 5-star. So, that was me. Anyone else got anything?
What's your favorite mushroom?
To eat? Amanita villosa. Absolute my favorite. The springtime amanita. That's in section Vaginate, and it's just so damn tasty. It's like brioche and hay and sunshine and caramel, and it's meaty and a little bit sweet and just so incredibly tasty. Morels are probably second though, so. Okay, morels. There's a page on them. It's in the advanced edible section, but there's like 3 clades with black, yellow, and sort of landscape morels. The black one's the ones we're going to get here in Burns in California. There is Morchella tridentina too, which comes up, and that's kind of a blonde morel. There's a lot of, I don't know if anyone is on like the Facebook forums with morel stuff, but there's a lot of really dumb people talking about morels. And I think this is partially because there's certain people who only interact with mushrooms like once a year when it's morels. And they have a lot of ideas about what they think they know, but they don't actually know much. So I love this little cartoon because it just kind of, my friend Sarah did it. And I don't like calling anything true or false. And I tried to avoid that, but I still did it a few points in the book because there's so many like, this is true, this is false. And this is a photo. I had my own version of this, but I ended up using Noah's photo because I just thought it was so good and it did such a good job of showing the differences there of how like Morchella are hollow, Verpa have pith in the middle, and then Geramitra, I mean, I would call that hollow too from the photo, but they're not. You know, you see these things side by side and they don't look like each other. They look pretty different. And there are examples of things that look more similar, but again, lots of photos helps you solve any kind of ambiguity. And that's why every single mushroom profile has a little QR code where instead of like relying on my like 3 or 4 photos, you can go look at thousands upon thousands of photos on iNet. And that's really what I encourage people to do is don't take my word for it. Like do your own research, but at least I'm directing you towards iNaturalist, which is the best place to do your research on mushrooms. Okay, morels are associated with spring. They really like soil to be between like 50, 60 degrees. They don't like it too hot, which is one of the problems that happen now. It's gotten pretty warm, and so a lot of the places where maybe the soil is the right conditions, the air conditions are not right. Out here, we're lucky that we have elevation. So a lot of places like Illinois, they get morels for like a week or 2, and then they're done because everything's flat. And so there's only one like aspect that they get, whereas we can go hunt from like, the end of March all the way through like the middle of July if we keep going higher and higher in elevation and we look for like little pockets of moisture. And out here, most of them are associated with conifers, although there are some that grow with other trees, madrones and oaks and etc. Morels, there's hundreds if not thousands of species of morels around the world. Here in California, we're usually hunting burn morels, but you can also get called like natural morels, ones that are coming up without fire. And you also get stuff that's sort of disturbance related. So often when you go to like logging sites and big slash piles, you can find morels there as well. And in urban wood chips, like back in February and March, there's probably people coming into Sonoma meetings bringing morels. We're like, I found this big patch of morels in my yard. I can't believe it. And it's like, that was probably the sclerotia came in on the wood chips and then fruited out. And that's why the next year they're not getting more morels because they had the sclerotia that came in with the wood chips, but they don't like seed down and form again. The sclerotia was coming from somewhere else. And you hear this from a lot of people like, morels once, but never again. And you're like, yeah, it's because, they gotta understand the sort of whole life cycle of it. And it's complicated because a lot of these morels are living inside of trees as endophytes. And then when the tree dies, they transition to becoming sapotrophic and are doing decay. And there's sort of a big question of like, are they mycorrhizal? Yes, no, maybe we don't totally know. I'm looking forward to talking to a guy I know this weekend, Sydney, who understands like nutrient transfer of these species a lot better than I do. And I want to ask Sydney a lot of questions about how this works. As far as I understand it, they grow after a fire. Mycelium will grow in the fall, probably form some sclerotia and then lay dormant over the winter. And then in the spring, when the temperatures are permissible, they grow out again, suck up all the nitrogen and carbon, and then produce mushrooms. But morels tend to be very associated with disturbance, so like a wildfire or like a plant disease. The Midwest, a lot of stuff is fruiting under like elm and ash because those trees are dying. I wrote about the fungal diseases that are killing those trees in the book. But because those trees are dying, they're getting a lot of morels into those trees. Out here, we have wildfire, which kills trees or stresses trees out, and then that sclerotia forms more mushrooms because the idea is that the morels are trying to come out and reseed like the next generation of stuff. And then morels are really dependent on the different types of bacteria and stuff that's in the soil. And so when they do like commercial cultivation, they have to pay a lot of attention to like the microbial mixtures of what's in the soil. When you're out in burn habitats, look for big burnout stumps, and you want to find trees that are burned but not like totally torched necessarily. Like what you want is a big burnout stump is great, but not if it's surrounded by completely burned trees. You want like a low intensity burn where there's still a good amount of duff on the ground, and the sun is not beating on your neck too hard, because you want there to be moisture in the soil. You want things to be like kind of cool. Another great strategy is to go find like big log and look along the side of it or underneath it. And if you're in a wet area where you see some moss and lots of little like Ascomyces cup fungi, that's good because there's more moisture there, so you're more likely to find morels. When you see stuff like this, you are in morel habitat after burn. You got the Anthracobia, little like charcoal eyelash cups, the carbon cups, the purple cups. Those are all things you're going to see. If you're not in a burn and you're trying to hunt natural morels, you're more likely looking for stuff like this. So like the purple crown caps, the spring orange peel, and like the snowbank morels are all good things to like keep an eye out for, because those are indicators that you're in the right temperature zone and permissible habitat for morels. But these aren't necessarily burn associated the way that like these things are very much burn associated. And this is some other shit you'll see in the mountains. Coltricia are really cool. I like these a lot. They're neat. This Cornarius is wild. It has like a super crazy veil. And then if you look up the Salish Sea, they have this really cool little guide to different morel types and verpa. So I thought this was really nice, and it's fun. So I hope you guys find some morels this year. Has anyone found morels yet this year? I'm not going to ask you where you went, but did you do well? In the mountains. Yeah. Okay. Okay. Cool. All right. Anyone have questions about morels? Yeah, shoot. Yeah.
How is it like the same? Like, what is the time frame between a burn and when they're leaving off?
Usually it's like the biggest flush is the year right after, and then every year it's sort of exponentially less and less and less. That being said, I went to a fresh burn this year and found like no morels basically. And I think that maybe next year it will really pop off once it has a chance to like have a little more time to digest or whatever. But I think usually you'll see, and someone can correct me on this, but usually you'll see like morels up to about 4 to 5 years after burn, and then after that it's pretty much done. But really the first like 2 years are where you're getting the most substantial amount. And it doesn't have anything to do with like, I mean, maybe a little bit, but like people harvesting morels isn't why there's not more. There's not more because all of that available carbon, nitrogen, and other stuff in the soil has now been sucked up, used up, and everything else is starting to like, life is coming back, and you need to have another form of disturbance to get the morels to like form again. So that's why generally if you want to hunt morels, like better to like gravitate towards fresher burns, or start trying to look for natural morels and try to key into like where those are growing. So, but you'll be looking for like different species and potentially different habitats. But again, most of what we're hunting under is going to be conifers, and I find that the firs tend to be the best, the white fir, the grand fir kind of thing. So that's another thing you can like, when you go out to hunt for morels, you have to do all this calculus of like, all right, what elevation am I at? Am I like a north-facing slope or a south-facing slope? Am I under pine? Am I under fir? Am I under like Pacific yew? The incense cedars never seem to like have a whole lot underneath them. You know, is there a drainage ditch, or is there a creek nearby? Can I get to like somewhere on that slope where there's like everything is just the right like set of conditions, and then just stay in that like that type of habitat?
What is the north versus south facing slope about? The south gives too much sun for them, or?
Well, so early in the season, the south-facing slope might be the best, because that's where it's, sometimes you'll see a morel growing in like direct sunlight, but that's where it's actually warmed up enough for it to grow. And then later on, at that point, the north-facing slope would be way too cold, be covered in snow. But later on, the north slope might be the one that has had less exposure, so it's gonna, have a morel there. It's all about like finding that little window where things make sense. And even then, they're mushrooms. They're gonna do what they want to do. They're not out there for us. So, yeah.
So, for example, when you said they go down exponentially after a fire, it made me think of, I can't remember how many years ago it was, I mean, it was pretty recent, but in the El Dorado area, after the Caldor fire,
Yeah.
so is that now entering the phase, so it's like really starting to take a dive?
Yeah, I did not. I've hunted the Caldor fire last 4 years. I did not go up there this year.
Last 4 years, so it's been that long since it happened?
I think so.
So what, like
site or somewhere that they're doing a bunch of fuel reduction, is that also like 1 to 2 years later?
I don't have as much experience hunting like slash morels, but I'd sort of, I mean, I think it's probably, like 2-3 years after big logging operations, you have a chance to find morels. And keep looking, But again, it's gonna keep going down. So if you're like, oh, there was so many last year and I'm just not finding much this year, you're like, yeah, that's just the way things go. Like, it's is what it is. Okay.
Yeah, so the logging morels up at the Caldwell Fire were there in the third year because the regular morels were tapering off.
Yep.
Logging occurred about a year and a half after the fire, so they brought up new morels. So that third year, everybody was looking at miles and finding morels there, but not finding any morels.
Yep.
Does it have to be, is it like slash piles that come after a fire? Or is it just any kind of?
I mean, I think anytime they're,
Disturbance.
it's killing trees is what causes the mushrooms to the morels to come out.
And just, they're using heavy equipment, they're putting ruts in the ground, and it's just the morels have an habitat to take over and they just go to fruit. Did you also want to mention the 50-degree thing, maybe?
Temperature? I mean, I said that they like soils between 50 and 60 degrees.
Yeah.
Where did that slide go? There you go.
That's generally a rule of thumb that, the snow recedes and then you're looking for the ground to warm up to 50. You can actually bring a soil thermometer out.
Hey guys, I'm gonna sign off here, but thank you for tuning in. Sorry that the screen was flipped. I'll get this talk on YouTube sometime. Bye. Thanks for being here.